located right at the corner of a lot of connection points, and therefore I located the entry right at this corner for easy access from all streets. Um, Before moving on to the details of the plan, I wanted to emphasize how, um, going back, uh, this folding envelope made out of concrete is also added with these wooden room boxes, which are inserted as modules into the folds. And these are another addition to the design where the bedrooms are a wooden subtraction of a box that are placed inside the modules of the room. Going on to the plan, the ground floor plan kind of shows a lot about the alignment from the largest arc opening of this facade and the alignment of the internal courtyards, kind of connecting these two streets and the east and west facade ends. It also kind of emphasizes the indoor-outdoor circulation once again to show that these two programs are grouped. These programs are of another type. And these are the most private and protected in the barrier wall. Um, What's shown in the second floor plan is that the circulation is biased towards one side, considering that the walls have a characteristic of a concrete wall on one side and an open end on the other side. And on that open end, these wooden modules are offsetted a bit from the floor boundary to add a design element to it, but also emphasize that they are insertion to the envelope. This short section and long section perspective are taken from one from the plaza and one from the uh, east facade, west facade, and the internal courtyard. The short section kind of shows that these three tails are protruding out of the wall and studies the relationship between the two tails and the distance and what that means to the plaza. And the long section uh, shows the alignment of this window to the arc window, which is behind us, and that internal courtyard that makes up that alignment, and also the key factor of the cut being continuous throughout the whole site. These are some experiential renderings. This is a rendering of the whole site showing how the street and the circulation path from the street into the entrance and the plaza, how they are in relationship to each other, and also how the geometries of the tails kind of mimic or reflect the buildings on the other side of the street where these are longer shapes and then these two are smaller house-like shapes. These are also some renderings of what's inside the building. This is of the bedrooms and the hallway, and this shows that difference between the wall of glasses kind of covering one side versus the side with the biased concrete wall where the fenestration patterns are of a different type. This rendering shows inside the dining area of the hostel how this in relationship to what's outside behind is the cafe, how they're both of similar qualities, being on the ground floor, being a tail-like feature, and as an eating and gathering and meeting area, but how they are kind of separated from each other to emphasize that the user and the purpose of the two rooms are different. Also, these long windows are to kind of reuse the idea of these glass panel walls of the long and rectangular shape of them. This is the entrance sequence in close-up detail, how these tails could be of different scales and different sizes and different purposes, and how these walls of the existing shell, fenestration of the existing shells could um, show how you can walk through the street and see what's inside and see that alignment.
So yeah, just you've been talking for like 8 minutes, so
Oh,
try to
really sorry.
find.
This is my last slide, almost my last slide.
Mm.
And then this is the design of that elevation of the back alley. This is a night version of the whole site, and then this is the final collection of all the work.
So, can I ask about the discipline that you've imposed upon yourself with this rotation through 90 degrees and the concrete as a ribbon? Did it break down for you anywhere? Did you feel that you'd run out of steam with this idea in any point of the plan, or was it a rich? You have counteracted it with the box and the intricacies of the wooden insert in a very kind of nice way, because it's at 90 degrees and can pop in and out. Feels like it's sliding, but did the concrete ribbon become a burden?
Definitely, because I started off with this idea way in the beginning as well. And before it was more about kind of being a Mobius or a fold. And it was hard because once you manipulate the scale of one side, everything else has to change with it too.
Mm.
And yeah, so I think that was the biggest problem. I had to restart this whole design last week. So, but I think it was a great challenge for me to see how the 9 degree folds of the roof, the floor, and the wall could interact with each other and interact with the shell.
And it's something that you're imagining is cast in place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in which case, for me, I'm wondering why it's not more plastic. That it,
Mm-hmm.
and if you come to something that is a stop point, that it could break its rules and sort of twist, morph, begin to feel less constrained because of its liquidity. It's potentially castable. And of course you did casting in the earlier part of the semester.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for going first. It's not easy to go first. I think that the ribbons, right? The concrete ribbons, they look so strong. The diagram in the upper left. I mean, it seems that in some ways you've done a really good job of documenting their kind of sectional consequence, right? What the effects of the ribbons are. But maybe at some point, even more clearly, you could show a little bit exactly what they are, right? Are there 4 of them? How many of them are there?
These 4 are the section through the long section.
Yeah.
Building.
But how many ribbons are there?
They're all continuous, so I guess 1.
Okay, so it's 1 ribbon and then it's broken.
Yes.
Okay, so it's 1 ribbon and then it has kind of additional moves to it, right? Where it's either negated or it's either made present or it's made absent. I guess maybe a little more clarity about that, would be nice to see. Similarly, too, I wonder what the rules are for some of these additional windows. Let me see if I can find a pointer in here. Is there a pointer or a? Not really. So if we go to the bottom right corner and then we go over, 1 more rendering to the left, please. Yeah, that's it, right? So we start to see these other windows that somehow are cut in, but I wonder what the rules are for those, right? I mean, we have this kind of clarity about what the concrete ribbons are. I wonder how and where we get to have these vertical apertures. So maybe just a little more clarity about kind of the pieces and parts or what the rules are within those pieces and parts. It's a nice project. The other thing I wondered about was, what are those grooves that show up? I think they show up in the courtyard, and then maybe they show up outside the courtyard. And I want to say they're in the floor condition. Yeah, so that center rendering that's kind of hanging off the upper left-hand side, right? Maybe on the plaza court. What are those on the one to the left?
To the left.
Yeah.
Perspectives.
And then the lower one right there, your sectional perspective, I think, yeah. What are those in the floor, please? Those look nice.
Oh, I imagine that the connection could either be continuous, but also continuous in the way that some are subtracted out. And I thought those could be not a clear circulation path, or that part is the clear path, but it was too large to be just all circulation. So I cut it up to be the biking parking area.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, I can't deny that the effects of whatever it is that you're doing to this sectional ribbon that's negated and made present and cut into and sliced is really strong. That comes through in your renderings. I just wonder, as soon as I see that, I thirst a little bit for what makes those rules and how many different games are going on and what are the rules of those games.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So building on that, stay on that section for just a minute, if you would. I think building on that, because I agree with those both previous comments. For me, what I keep looking at for in this, because I do think there's some real clarity to how you began to organize your project, and I'm interested, if you can, describe a little bit of what your intent is of the relationship between the wood, the concrete, and the brick, because you kept a lot of the brick, right? And they all have a relationship to each other. So if you can speak to that for just a minute.
I think the main purpose of the brick is to create the boundary between the two types of, or more, three types of program elements. And the concrete ribbon would be more of the structural element as well as what's bounding the building. And I think the wooden elements are what are the most private and habitable spaces of the building, where the internal courtyards or public areas and plazas could be shared among everyone. The wood can be the divider between the smaller spaces.
Okay, I think programmatically, because there's a nice logic, right? The places where the people are going to be and they're going to be next to and they're going to be touching are wood, right? It's got a very nice kind of tactile quality. I would encourage you, though, as you were saying you were developing this quickly, which is always a bit of a trick with these projects, right? But I would encourage you to think about, just be very intentional. And I think this gets to the last question about the windows. You know, be very specific and very intentional as to kind of how you bring those different materials together. You know, does the concrete just pass through the brick? Is there a gap there? Is there an overlap? How do these things interact with each other? And it shows up in a couple little instances where at the tops of those of your windows, you're leaving just a little piece of wood, right? And I'm pointing on a pointer that you can't see. I'm sorry. So,
But there, yes.
I'll just draw on my screen instead. But at the tops of those windows, right, you left these tiny little pieces of wood, right? And part of me wants to hope that that's intentional, but I want you to really take control of that. Like, no, like, is the wood a plane, or is it a series of planes that are broken into panels? And there's a big difference in terms of then how you put all that together. And it may be different in the public realm to the private realm. I very much enjoy the kind of second floor of your project, the little cells and the pods and the kind of rhythm you get. You have a really rich spatial sequence out of some really simple parts. on that second floor, which I think is really great. And so my last piece is I like that you described a vertical sequence through your project, but I wish that I would encourage you to think about that vertical sequence actually moving more with the ribbon, right? So instead of having to put a stair into your ribbon, and that sequence actually be all part of, you know, can you move, kind of use, if the concrete is doing the folding and the moving, and I think you're in the right direction, because it looks like your stair is probably in your concrete language, but it almost wants to kind of be part of the ribbon, I think, because it's kind of an outlier right now. But I'm kind of going to that next level, how these things come together, you know, how brick meets concrete meets wood, glass meets these things, you know. So I think there's some really clear spatial logic, and this is, I think, what Mary Lou was getting at too, is the other fun thing is once you get that rule set up, then what happens if you break it in one little piece, right? And that's, I think, where Mary Lou was going. So.
Yeah, and there's another thing about the behavior of the material that you're with. If the concrete could be almost like an industrial artifact that has been left behind, it sort of feels like it's a piece of a drain pipe, or was it some other bridge structure, and that your boxes had a ceiling and a kind of materiality that appeared underneath the concrete ribbon, then it would tell us that you're thinking about the insert or the habitable space, insulated, soft, textured. You wouldn't have that temptation for the margin between the top of the window and the ceiling. You'd have begun to think about the making of the whole box. And so in the fundamental thinking, when you were describing it as this is something which is both the floor, the wall, the roof, and the landscape, yes, it is traveling in those directions, but it's not the insulation, it's not the soft surface in which you are able to support the beds. You're not building a concrete environment as the most intimate one, and that means that you could almost kind of slip them visually and materially in constructional terms, which might be, you know, might just give it a little bit more energy.
All right, well, we should move on. Thank you, Sijan.
Thank you.
Very nice project though.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's interesting to call the front of the project the tail. I like that.
Yes.
June, do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
All right.
So I made a PowerPoint. Well, I guess I'll start off with how I kind of approached this hostel project. So in considering that it's a hostel, I wanted to definitely make it interactive within, and also have the courtyard that was required as part of the space, as part of the main space of the circulation, and also the hostel in general. So these are my very tiny plans. I'll just make it bigger. I approached this project by seeing the shell as like a bigger mass, and extruding that outwards to fill kind of a squarish shape of the site, and also kind of enclosing that mass and using the shell to do that in order to create my hostel. So in order to enter, I go in through this side, and I wanted to create fluidity within the shell, and also use the facade of it to kind of juxtapose my actual, like, the interior and the exterior. So the front facade is more, it looks like it blocks it off just like the shell, but when you enter, it opens up into a bigger courtyard inside that is pretty open and interacts with most of the second floor and the ground floor. You're able to enter through the public space, which is this space in the front, and this is the semi-private space, which houses all the here, which houses all the public and semi-private spaces on the ground floor, such as a cafe, reception, library, group dining, kitchen, and all that. On the second floor of my hostel, I put in all the all the private functions, and allowed the circulation to act around the shell of the pre-existing shell. I thought that this would create more of a dynamic circulation, and it would create interaction between the activities of the hostel on the ground floor as well as on the second floor. Because the circulation hugs the shell, I wanted to kind of direct all the masses of the private functions to direct towards the inside of the courtyard to like they're converging towards the center. There's mini courtyards in the as shown by like the yellow hatches, that kind of incorporate a little bit of like peace and oasis, I guess, inside this shell that seems really daunting from the outside, as it's very closed, but it's actually very occupiable and interacts with like all the space and the shell as well as all the different masses. So this is my, I guess, private functions on an exploded view. And for my facade, just as I was describing that it was more daunting in the front, it is the height of the actual shell, and is the material is of like light gray stone, and the entrance to that is only accessible from the front, in this main entrance, and also the entrance to the cafe, and also in the back, where the bike rental is. This is a sectional perspective of from the main entrance right here, and it cuts through the mass on the second floor, which is 2 stories tall. Well, not 2 stories, like kind of like a lofted 2 stories tall, in order to give all the space for the hostels and the people. And this is another perspective that shows the other 2 masses on the second floor, and the courtyard on the ground floor, and the courtyards on the second floor that are created.
Can you just clarify whether you are outside from little cabin to cabin on your upper level? So
Okay.
maybe show us the plan. I'm not quite sure where the edge of the envelope is.
So on the second floor, the masses are connected on this side, these 2, through this entrance. I mean, through
Oh,
through
right.
space up, and also being able to access these 2 spaces from the indoors. But in order to access the other 2, these would have to be you would have to like go outside, and then these would be like more outdoor courtyards, while you can access these 2 indoors through this like through this corridor space.
And socially, we didn't ask whether you'd had an experience in a hostel. What's your social model? How are you imagining this discrete building separation might begin to affect the users of the hostel?
Like this current situation, or
Yes,
just
on what you're drawing something very particular as a room set.
right.
So how are you viewing the benefit
I
of that?
wanted definitely to have the hostel be a lot more interactive, and I think I kind of described that more in my ground floor plan, where the circulation literally runs through all the functions and all the programs on the ground floor. And in order to access, I guess, any which like second floor private mass on the second floor, you would have to go through all the programs on the ground floor in order to access that, so that it would kind of foster an environment that kind of encourages more like fluidity between people who visit the hostel and also live in Pittsburgh and might want to just go to the hostel. Like it kind of creates like a mini environment that I hope that is different from like the rest of Pittsburgh, but also kind of still is. It kind of is just like a mini environment, I feel like.
Yeah, I'm reading it as almost like a large house in the upper floor, or four large houses that you are identifying, and just through their separated vertical circulation, they've already become distinct on the lower level. So I've got a completely other kind of question, which is to do with extending the original frame, but leaving no trace of the line which was closing it on the long side. So what was your kind of rationale for that, and how did you, it was the wrong shape, so you blew one wall out. What's your kind of feeling about the reverence for the margin between the new box and the old box?
Well, I definitely think that there is a difference, but I wanted to kind of incorporate it and kind of seamlessly, I guess, like kind of merge the two in a sense. I feel like I respected the difference between the actual shell by kind of acknowledging through through like this shape right here, like and like the courtyard is like directly within the shell, and it doesn't really leave the shell except for the circulation outside towards the context of the hostel site. So I kind of use the notion of removing one wall would open up the hostel to the rest of Pittsburgh and the site, but also kind of re-enclosing it in a way to like use it as like kind of a blockade and more of like a more of a private hostel for the people who would stay there, if that makes any sense.
Well, yes, it does. I think the closer I look at your drawings, I begin to realize that you've left the brick, three sides of the brick box, and then
Yes.
you've drawn in what you're imagining is a stone inner box.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's, so my next question would be about how do you imagine the stone wall is constructed? Is it stone cladding on the outside of a steel frame? What is it?
I also kind of fleshed this design out very quickly because I was struggling with it for a really long time, to be very honest.
But beyond how it's constructed, because
Yeah.
that is a good question. But even to take a step back, is the stone, right? The stone fits your description of kind of putting up a wall to the south. And actually, one of the compelling images in your presentation was that facade image for me with the orange.
Yeah, with a huge hole and a little hole.
And because there, the stone, you're using it, that's how I imagine, the stone is a tricky material, right? And you're supposed to be thinking about what the materials, how they behave. So the real question is, should the whole inside of this be made of stone? Is that an environment that we want to be in? I would maybe more press you to kind of think about that question. What are the materials? And it's not just wood's one, but there's plenty of good materials. Like for what do you want to, if the material choice that you make affects how people engage with the thing that you're proposing. And different materials have very different qualities in terms of how they feel, how they whether they're hot, cold. And I think that for me is where I struggle a little bit. I at first I was really bothered that you were rebuilding the
box.
envelope is bigger. I was like, well, but I think you've shown some intent there. The piece that I want to question a little bit in your logic, because I think you're thinking very nicely about how people flow through space. But what's very curious to me is you've completely vacated the courtyard and everything flows around the courtyard and never really, I think, engages it. And I could expect on the first floor, you're doing these diagrams with these kind of, your flowing lines. And I wonder, how do you imagine that courtyard engaging with that movement? Is it part of the movement or is it just a bystander?
I imagined it more of a space that people would kind of gather towards, because the public the public space, which involves a cafe, is kind of the blockade between what is more public and what is inside the hostel, I guess. I wanted the public place was a barrier, but also the courtyard was a barrier between like the more private, the more publicness of it, and also like where go up to the masses. I mean, to the private masses on the second floor, kind of view down towards the courtyard and kind of just see what's going on down there. I hadn't really thought of a specific program for it, just more of like a chill space, I guess.
Well, I think it's important to, in many ways, that space is going to have very different character on that first floor than on the second floor. And the second floor, you're thinking that, yes, those private spaces are raised up from it. So there is a different interaction with the lower floor, but it'd be interesting to see that develop a little too. Like, what does it mean to create privacy where maybe in the rooms you can see down into the courtyard, but from the courtyard, we can't see up into the rooms, something like that. I think there's a few moments where you're fighting kind of with some of the geometry that you put in place, just because all the private rooms are, facing each other.
Yeah. They do face each other, but the pods inside of them kind of like don't allow them to actually like look into each other, I guess. So like they all have like a kind of corridor in the front so that people wouldn't be able to like look up directly into it and kind of respect the privacy of it. And also the pods would allow for each person to have like their own space or like their own nook inside, and like not allow in any unwanted ones, I guess.
So this is Lori. I feel like that's sort of one of the missed opportunities, is that you did create this very inward facing experience, and you allowed for the possibility of this courtyard or this internal, the possibility of an oasis. There was something really nice about that section perspective that I could begin to imagine that internal space being a nice respite. But I agree with Ken's comments that there's really no capitalizing on that big move. And then the views, while I don't think that these pods should look at each other necessarily, it would be really nice if they could look to something, or they could be experiencing some communal event, and that outdoor space wasn't just sort of left over. It feels like it really deserves to be designed intentionally too.
It's maybe the problem of giving it a single color and not beginning to imagine the footprints wearing the paths through it that might begin to give it a sense of inhabitation.
I tend to agree. I think it's a matter of layers of distinction, right? I mean, if we accept that the walls of the host building are daunting, right? And it would have been, I think it'd be nice to make a couple of runs at that graphically, trying to establish that architectural argument that they are daunting. That's kind of a nice challenge. But presuming that they are, right, then in terms of the broadest of strokes, you left the walls, you intended to leave the walls alone, and then have kind of a separate mechanism for ordering these masses independent of that. But then the rule kind of got broken because one of them kind of backs into a corner, and in the renderings and also through the use of color, there's not quite the distinction that one might expect, right? So if the host wall is daunting, then the masses are blank. And as many times as it was mentioned that the host wall is daunting, I don't know that you ever got around to saying what your masses were in contrast to that. And but so if you establish that word, then you might be able to figure out how that gets rendered in terms of materiality, in terms of detail, in terms of massing, in terms of scale, in terms of aperture. It might have presented some kind of architectural decisions. I think that same level of kind of graduated decision making. You had two categories of spaces, right? Public and semi-private. And I'd like to suggest that's probably not enough, right? The way you talk about the spaces is different than you categorize them. And so maybe if within your litany of the programmatic spaces mapped against the categories in which you expected them to appear, if that were somehow had more depth to it and more of a range, that might have reminded you to show that in the architecture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's quite an achievement to be scattering something, which is what you're trying to do with these four pieces on the second floor and a fifth on the third floor. For me, it's got some kind of reminiscent flavor of the hermit's meditative space. I know there's a lot of people stuffed in each of these different kind of blocks that you're setting up, but there is something, and maybe there's a really nice Irish scheme by Andrew Clancy that you could look at, where they settled in very different orientations the spaces for the monks to live and meditate. But there's the fact that you're offering us an outdoor space as well as an indoor space. That's a very intelligent response to the privations of the bunk bed slot or whatever kind of dark little hole they've got to put their rucksacks in and call home for the visit. So, I think that there's socially, I'm just curious about how this might begin to add up as those grades that Paul's talking about of the where are you really private, and maybe it's only in the bathroom because the bedrooms are somewhat kind of peopled. And that actually thinking outdoors on that little terrace that nobody's going to walk past, maybe that's where it happens. So interesting.
Perfect. Okay, we're on time. Thank you, June.
Thank you.
Thank you, June.
Let's move on to Cody.
Hello. I would like to share my screen. For my project, I would like to start with my plan to talk about the initial ideas. For this brick envelope, when my initial idea was to use single rotation to create a edge condition that breaks the boundary of the box to allow more engagement with the community towards the public space, and set up the entry sequence by this volume protruding outwards. And I started off by developing the living units I created this kind of idea of capsule hotel. So like I kind of arranged the spaces from the service space down beside the entrance, and then you get to the living space, and there's a porosity that you can get a view from the sitting area towards the windows. And I kind of created these two types of units to engage like more community space down there, but also I have this pod capsule feature that allows people to sleep in a cozy like restrained space so that they have more opportunity to engage in the community space within the pods. And for this section, I kind of play around with the different arrangement of these living units. One of the things I noticed is this, I want to create like different levels of porosity and engagement with the nature. So I intentionally distance these pods by creating gaps, and this allows the sunlight to get into the apertures that I created within like the distance from these pods. So this creates a more natural lighted environment that enables people to feel more cozy. And in terms of material choice, I think I would like to use wood as the horizontal element so that for each floor and roof conditions, I try to unify the space by applying a warm colored wood texture on it so that people feel like this space is more as a light feeling. And the existing wall on the first floor kind of shows the entry sequence, and people can get from the street view to the front check and get into the building. So the rotation part is mostly the public space and where the cafe and the reception happens. And for this part, is more private. So like there are different kinds of activities that can happen in those pod cells. This is one level of privacy change. And I think the courtyard is more of a open air community space where, because when I visit the site, I feel like it is a self-referenced world within the brick shell from the urban oasis. Like it's like an urban oasis. So I want to preserve that kind of natural feeling by making it a open air space and can be accessed from different sides of the programs. And that's about the section perspective. And in terms of the material use, I mainly used wood, concrete, the existing brick shell, and glass bricks to create a sense of glowing property at a night view. So like in this render, the lights is protruding out from the apertures. In the real world, I think this kind of creates a sense of community by, because when people actually inhabit it, I'm imagining like different kinds of lights or human figures that is behind that semi-transparent glass bricks. So I'm thinking like creating this kind of transparency without totally exposing it is a way to create a hostile feeling. and this is the entrance from the open area from the street view. And this is the reception deck. And this is the second floor corridor, which you can see there's a sitting area that looks towards the courtyard. And the brick, like the glass bricks, kind of gives you a feeling of the urban view, but not totally exposing it, because it's like more private space on the second floor. And that's it.
Cody, could you leave us on the plan? I'm still trying to work out. Yeah, that's helpful.
Cody, I really appreciated the night view. That was a really compelling view. And I think it shows that you were thinking about the occupancy. I mean, a hostel is sort of an unusual building to occupy, right? Because it kind of has it's sort of flipped. It's occupied kind of only in evenings and mornings and night. And most of the time, those travelers are kind of out exploring the cities that they're in during the day. So there's a different kind of occupancy shift that it takes. So I just appreciate that you took that view as a nice view.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I feel like for the hostel, most of the time, in terms of when we talk about like hostels in relation to the city, I feel like most of the time we spend in hostels should be like the time we rest, and then we spare some time to maybe communicate with the people inside of this hostel community.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like also the site gives me a feeling that it's like a self-referencing world. So I would like to create like a sense of community within the brick shell to like foster that interaction.
Cody, but I don't really see that level of interaction, that level of commonality. Looking at your floor plans, I think I have to imagine, for instance, where the kitchen is, where the cafe is, how that, you know, I only see like the rooms, some sort of like circulations, but I don't see that much of, you know, interaction just by looking at your floor plans. I think like the document that better shows perhaps that is the section perspective, but even though out of as of right now, I don't really know where, say, the kitchen and where the people gather to just simply have breakfast together or dinner together. What like where is it on the ground floor, on the second floor?
So for the public space, I mainly focused on this part, and this is the reception deck, and I feel like, because I want to create a free plan on the public space. So like this part, I feel like it can be multifunction. So like at the night, it can be like community space, but in the daytime, it can be like inhabited with the cafe setting also. So I really want to explore the efficiency use of the space. As you can see, like I created this like individual volume study. I intentionally put the living space in an upper level to create like more community space down within the each pods. And I feel like this introduced a question about like on what level would you want to share your experience with other strangers? So I feel like there are two different types of layers for dining, or maybe things that are people are more eager to share when they visit a hostel with the friends. I feel like I'm more inclined to put into the pod, but for like multi-functions such as cafes or checking space or a courtyard space, I feel like it is more compelling for me to put them outside of the pod and let the community space to do its job.
Yeah, but we need to imagine that, Cody. That's my, like, if you wanna go for a multifunctional space, just draw the different, you know, activities that happen there, and perhaps, you know, like you represent that, but kind of leaving that open as, you know, interpretation. Anyways, let's hear other voices.
Yeah, Cody, I think you made a good effort of the individual units and some of the shared units, but the public shared space on the front quadrant there that's angled, it definitely needs some more programming and articulation for the shared spaces. And the front yard, there's a little bit of ambiguity on whether it's a front porch and where you actually enter the enclosed building. I think that just needs to be identified a little more in that front region.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think the porch as a gesture is a good idea, and but I also agree with these other comments. I think in order then to kind of let that develop, and I guess Cody, I want to encourage you to kind of take some of what you're doing and you're saying, and listen a little bit to kind of how you're describing what you're doing, and then I think look at if you can get that out of your drawings without saying anything, because I think the idea of a big multi-purpose space is it's a nice idea, right? But as Manuel's saying, I agree. You got to test that, and often that space may not be a kind of triangular wedge, right? The courtyard kind of coming into the building is a nice idea, and I think there's inherently some really clever moves that begin, I think, in this project. I want to encourage you to kind of take them the next step and kind of finish them and like really let them resolve, because even just the units, the thinking of creating these little pods and kind of this living space, there's a nice sequence in there. Let some of that kind of continue to mature. For me, like I still believe in this idea of craft, whether that's how we put things together, but also how we present what we do. And I know that's one of the things that you were asked to do with this project, because I actually think in many ways there's some really nice moments in this project that I was a little bit frustrated because I was like, oh, I just wish that you had really made them sing. Even in that night rendering, I agree with Lori that I think it's a nice, especially with your glass block, it's a great thought to do that. But then it should be teeming with life, right? It should have people everywhere. It should feel like we're seeing this little kind of hive of activity that's hostile, right? And so there's just this next layer. I think this simple move of just pulling this volume out through the brick, I'm fine with that. Again, I'll take it. I think having it resolve where the corners align is a problem, because I think there's a real opportunity there to create some incredible tension and real interest and entry where those two don't meet so neatly. You know what I mean? Do you see what I mean, Cody? Right? Kind of where your angled volume is ending up, the corners matching so neatly to the brick. I think that, yeah, exactly. I think you have but twisting it out and creating that porch, I think that's a great first move. I like it. So
yeah, I think what you're hearing consistently is we're a little frustrated, right? I mean, some of these moves are really strong, or some of the things you're talking about are really strong. They're just kind of not quite tested enough to be able to be completely validated. But yeah, this breakthrough through the brick that becomes a porch, that sounds like a crazy strong option, right? But then we really want to see it kind of finish its way all the way out. And then the way that kind of sectionally you talk about layered space in terms of the rooms and the pods, and I suppose ultimately the entirety of the program. Again, that sounds like a wonderful move, and then we don't quite see it completely. Well, we don't see it resolved. We don't see it brought to kind of an entirely believable opportunity. But trust those strong moves, because those look really good. I'd say just really dig after them and try to substantiate their strength.
I'd like to just talk about accessibility, and this is a sleeping arrangement for the very able-bodied, and I'm hoping that you've also thought about the possibility of being in a wheelchair and having an option to be able to have as interesting an arrangement as you've got for people who can clamber up over the boxes and slither into a tube.
Yeah, sure. Because in terms of accessibility, yeah, because these are highly modulated, I should definitely include more like sorts of utility within, like I can alter like one module or two modules to be satisfying that, like to include more diversity into it.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of overdid the yard work on Saturday and tried to recover from my the emergence of my mortality on Sunday. Right. I'd love to think on a good day I could enjoy some of these spaces, but I don't know, Cody. Hey, one thing specific in terms of kind of addressing and really digging after things. Think about it in terms of the scales of your drawings. When you were describing some of your early drawings, or when you were describing some of your drawings early in the presentation, but to generalize throughout, I think you're either offering a generosity or, as the author, a privileged knowledge about what you're drawing that's really much more difficult for us to see. And one of the reasons is I think it's small, right? So I don't know, draw things at 6 inches is a foot, and see if it stays quite as rich as it is with what you're able to read from your own diagrams.
Yeah.
Yeah, that for me is that craft too, because even this section perspective has a lot of potential, but now I'd sit down and be like, all right, so let's work on the line weights. Let's work on the, even I like that you were thinking about where the sun was and how it's coming into these units, but instead of a kind of cartoon diagram of the sun, you have the data, what angle it is in the summer, what angle it is in the winter. And what's interesting there is it's going to behave very differently at different times of year, right? And so, apply just a little bit of that rigor to that diagram and these drawings, and they'll really come to life. I know we're saying do more, but I think that next level, it's because your inherent sort of basic moves have some strength to them, and I think that's why we want to see them be as rich as I believe they can be.
Mm-hmm.
So
30 seconds left, Cody. I think just the takeaways, perhaps the representation. I think like in any case, like we substitute, like the physical modeling because we weren't able to do it by the, like a kind of achieve a great level of representation. I think it's just kind of giving some depth to your drawings. You could achieve much more. You could represent a little bit better your ideas. And I really, really agree with this kind of cartoonish sun rays. You should have worked with shadows, right? And that would have been much better. But anyways, we appreciate the work. Thank you, Cody.
Thank you.
Let's move on to Margot.
Yeah, let me just share my screen. Okay, so my name is Margot, and for my spring garden hostel, the main idea of the project is that it's composed up of 2 key volumes that are offset from each other, each volume being one of the respective stories of the structure. And the lower volume is meant to serve most of the public functions and needs, while the upper volume is meant to be mostly private and more quiet in comparison. So specifically, the ground volume is mostly made up of a free-flowing open space, and it's meant to encourage circulation around the area and encourage the meeting and mingling of both people staying at the hostel as well as those from the local community. And the ground level is technically open to everyone, but it has been divided by a few key elements, such as this center cafe space or these long tables. And so the purpose of that was to maintain the idea of a mainly open plan while also separating and dividing the space a little bit to section off some slightly more private areas that are mostly meant to for the function of the people that are actually staying at the hostel. And so between the interior space as well as the different exterior spaces, the idea is to engage the entire community through a variety of indoor and outdoor spaces. And moving on to the second story plan, it's meant to be pretty much just a private space, really only accessible to those that are actually staying in the hostel. And it's made up of a series of modules of either 2 bunk bed to 4 bunk bed rooms that are arranged in a way to help avoid this idea of just a monotonous hallway down the space. And so by kind of arranging these modules in such a way, it creates little nooks and outlooks between the rooms where people can congregate in a little more of a privater and quieter setting. So while it does break this idea of this single long hallway, it still does kind of contain this it does still draw people down in a single line. And this is kind of, this is a little bit framed with this large window at the end of the volume, which helps draw people down as well as providing a view at the end. And so another part of the second story plan is that it lets out into this roof terrace, which is the roof of the lower volume, which is an outdoor space that is solely used for those staying at the hostel. And so where the 2 volumes intersect is just this small square space that happens at that intersection of the axes, and that is represented with a light box, which kind of frames this area and also brings light into the center spaces of the ground floor, such as that cafe space or that main dining area. And so the way that the upper volume is situated also kind of dramatically hovers over the front end of the site, which helps to redefine this plaza space as well as kind of draw in people from the local community to use this protected area. The other significant outdoor space is created by the pre-existing walls. And so that would provide an enclosed rear courtyard space, which is while still open to everyone in the community, it's a little bit more privatized in the sense that you would actually have to progress through the space, like through the hostel, in order to reach it. And so, like I said before, there's this dramatic, almost cantilever of the upper volume over the plaza, which redefines it and kind of gives it this new, it almost frames the area. And it also provides a large outdoor shaded space that can be used by all those in the community for a variety of purposes. And yeah, that's pretty much the gist of the presentation.
So just as a clarification question, is your entry towards the kind of northwest corner?
Yeah, so the main entry would be where you're speaking, which is, can you see my cursor also?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it would be where you were speaking. Although this does serve as an entry point, I was thinking like mainly the main entry you were talking about would be, it would kind of lead right into that reception desk area, which is represented by this pod structure here, while this other entrance does serve as a primary entrance, but it's more for the public purposes, such as going to the cafe or utilizing the seating that's outside.
So Margot, I'm looking from, you've got such a clear sense of the discrete volumes, which look like perfect skins across rectilinear blocks, that it's such a very simple, clear, rotational diagram. That I'm missing something which might be there of a sense of the solid and void beginning to activate the surfaces. So just putting the glass on the same surface plane as the skin of the upper block, it feels to me like it's lost one of the, you know, kind of delights of that thing having some structure. It's got some depth of beam. It might be looking like it's got a suggestion of a balcony at the end of it or something, you know, that there's opportunities for the consideration of the stuff that it's made of to begin to give it some depth on the surface. And stepping out of that door down some steps onto a roof looks miserable. I could, you know, such a precipitous, you don't get to the top of the steps and then start opening the door. You know, there's a sort of a not yet imagined idea about what it is to go from inside to outside. So the question about where is the front door is for me is really telling, because you've pulled out a porch which protects, you know, we know what Pittsburgh's like. It's never stops raining. It's miserable getting into any doorway. So you don't want to find that double door for the reception desk to be the place that you're struggling to get yourself in and out. That center is the covered, you've offered generous kind of suggestion of entry. You should celebrate that, and signify it more effectively. So the two blocks, when you're saying that, should have a light box effect between them. Actually, it's probably the dark box. You know, it's not there. It's deep. It's covered. It's shaded. It's you're looking for look, no hands, no structure, but that's probably not what's happening there. There's some very key structural moments that you need to begin to think through. You've given it two big columns well set in from the corners of the front end, but then that load has got to be carefully thought through to get back to the perimeter of the box, and somehow those extra thicknesses are going to be your friend, not your foe. Mm-hmm. So I think it's still diagrammatic, and yet the modulating the skin is where you can begin to get a lot more pleasure out of the passage through the space.
Okay.
I'm gonna kind of continue with that thought. I think in terms of how you articulate this, and I think Mary Lou, you just used the term, you know, voids in these volumes, and right now you're literally just punching windows and doors, which is not necessarily the architectural solution to that problem, right? It's functional. It's a door. We can go through it. It's a window. It lets in light. But the you know, I think there's some logic that perhaps you would expect a kind of rhythm of punched openings for the units. I think that makes sense. And there's some logic that this end would be big, but then you don't just stop there. Like, you don't just stop by saying that's a window. You want to, I think you can, that's where you really take authorship as a designer. that either becomes something that's pushed back very deep into it, or it wraps the corner, or it goes floor to ceiling. I think on a couple of these conversations today, I've used this term intent. Make sure you have a very clear intent as to how these things start and stop, how they turn corners. That gets to, I think, the other point of how these two boxes join each other. I think you're on the right track. Like, your gut is right that these two boxes shouldn't just sit on top of each other, that they needed to somehow separate or overlap or have a distinct relationship to each other. I think that was the right idea. Now, the question is the rendering of it the right way? Maybe not. But thinking that they need to have a specific relationship, spot on. I was really hoping that you were going to tell me that that wasn't the entrance, and that the entrance actually looped all the way back around the brick and kind of into this back courtyard, because that sequence and this image on the right has some lovely potential. And this is another scheme where, I think actually the planning in the scheme, and, with a kind of formal manipulation, that's the sequence kind of through this thing actually could be quite nice. I second, I think there's some inherent logic in terms of how you're creating that outdoor space on the second floor. I think it's the right thing to do it, and to put it to the south where you put it, and to leave it behind the brick wall. All good moves. I think the problem was there, once you start making those stairs, you're solving a problem that you made by pulling the boxes apart. But then you want to approach it a different way. And that just may mean, you don't want to come down the stairs. You maybe put a plank out, or that's where if you're fixing something that you did, then you gotta, take a step back and be like, all right, so I gotta fix that. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So I think there's actually 3 boxes, right? There's the brick box, and then there are the 2 boxes that you introduced. And I really love the possibilities in there. And I think your kind of big move of rotating one against the other is a good first big move. And I think you've made some nice, like I was looking, there's some nice kind of subtle plan moves that you've done up in here that are pretty thoughtful. I think you have a good instinct about some of those things. This space feels so long and narrow. Like, it feels like if I've just kind of gone through this sequence that everyone talked about, and that there deserves to be a little bit more generosity of the proportion of that space at the end, because it does have a nice opportunity to kind of re-engage with the neighborhood there. But I think some of your big moves are heading in a good direction. They just kind of want to be nudged deeper into the exploration. And I agree with some of the comments too. I'm so glad you have the section, because the section tells you so much. Actually, the section, these 2 drawings, right? The section kind of tells me that space under that overhang could be kind of heavy and kind of dark and kind of ominous. It may not feel as nice as your words want it to be. And the same with this space back here. It may be dark. It'd be the sort of thing that you'd want to take, your 3D model, or look at some daylight studies, and really, or if you had a physical model, which I understand you didn't, right? You could start to really understand the spatial quality of those spaces. So I don't think they'd be quite as friendly as you'd be hoping. So then the trick would be to, what do I do to change that, or what could I do to make those spaces more hospitable?
Right. Okay.
So do a test. I used to actually ask students to do this all the time, like to take your floor plan, you turn off all your doors and door swings, and then look at your floor plan and see if you have an entry. Because it should appear as something that is architectural, that is part of the sequence. And if it does, and you actually have 2 potential entries, because you could slide around the side, or you could use your porch, right? You've kind of given yourself choices. So, but then you pick the 3rd one.
I feel like there could have been something. I was actually trying, I can't quite zoom in enough for myself, but there's something about the way that the box
I can go back and slide.
It's okay because it's actually useful to have these all here. But there's something about that box over the first box, right? Creates something different about this zone, which I think you mostly recognized. You kind of mostly recognize that there's something different than this zone, but it's kind of like they didn't quite get treated intentionally differently enough. So
Mhm.
I actually don't mind that the entry is here. I feel like there's a lot of logic to that, the visibility of that. I do wish that there was something architecturally that acknowledged that, even a canopy or some sort of something bigger than just that door and that wall. Whether that box changed plane or something about this zone distinguish itself from the rest of that lower box.
Okay.
But I think my sense is that you probably took this view a bit later in the process, and it's actually really useful, the view to design from, right? You could start to, it's the view that highlighted what Mary Lou said about the door kind of spilling down onto the roof, and it gives you the understanding of that view. I feel like those views are important to take sooner than later so that you can understand the spatial implications of all that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really nice question. So Margot, did you do
Yeah.
that rendering to document something else that you'd already decided about, or was it also its own kind of form of inquiry?
I actually had that view kind of from the get-go. This is before a lot of the technicalities, like the doors, and even before I had kind of decided how to separate those two volumes with that box. And so I think the main reason for placing the entrance where I did, I do agree with your comments though, was more just like the convenience purposes. And I kind of like what Lori was just saying, is kind of a little bit on the basis of where I was going with it, but I do agree that it should be maybe fleshed out in a way, if I were to keep it there, which I'm not necessarily suggesting, that kind of highlights it as an entry more than just a door.
Yeah, your drawing at this point is bigger than your face on my screen, but I thought I detected you smile when Lori said that, so I thought that maybe somehow you were looking at maybe a different part of the rendering, right? Because you were thinking that image was showing you something different, rather than reminding about an opportunity to still address something.
Mm-hmm.
One other simple thing too that could further articulate your different floors is you have these you have this floor plane here and you have this roof plane here, and kind of like the node that Lori mentioned that's overlapping in this section, you could take advantage of your staircase here and pull it into where the nodes come together, and you could open up somehow these two spaces and how they conjoin together. And you could also explore possible openings through here to get more light into your courtyard and just things like that. So I think you have the overall form and pieces of all the, it's just a matter of sliding and further articulating the, the horizontal and the vertical planes and how it all comes together.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about the bus routes. Is there a bus that comes anywhere near this big corner gesture?
I believe that there is, but I don't know its exact proximity. I'm sorry.
Because it sort of feels like you're making a very grand plaza here. What's there now seems rather sort of sadly industrial and a little bit like a parking opportunity behind chain link fences, not quite as grand as it's beginning to turn into. But it'd be nice if there was public transit going through this whole little nexus, and that it felt like you're beginning to activate it in a pretty dramatic way.
Along those lines, I wasn't thinking necessarily about per se a transport route, but there are a few like little local businesses. The main one being, I don't remember the exact name, but there's a beer garden just like maybe a block away, and there's another one in the opposite direction as well. And both of them offer this kind of idea of everyone coming together and sitting out in the front area in front of the building. And so that was kind of my inspiration to keep the front pretty cleared in front of the building itself, to kind of mimic that concept. It was done in a more of a dramatic way, but which is a little out of context, but again, the neighborhood is kind of ever changing, and maybe this was a way to kind of address and push forward with that change.
Good.
Just to finish that, sorry, one last comment. I think that for me, that decision to make this public space to the southeast is a really great first step. So, but I want to similarly, don't just stop by putting the space there. So you need to, if you're designing this, design that space, right?
Mm-hmm.
Show us what it looks like, what it's textured like, what materials are there. Is it all part green? Is it part, right? You've just barely kind of started that dialogue. So you just described a really sort of thoughtful observation about the neighborhood. And your job then is to draw that, you know, then own that and make it part of your project. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Margot. Let's move on to the last student of this first half of the afternoon. Sharon, you want to share your screen?
So I made a PowerPoint. So I'll start with a part T. And so my main focus was to explore the relationship between the existing shell and the newly placed building mass. So my initial concept was to use kind of interlacing like modular type of building blocks to divide up the space. And this allowed me to create different kinds of threshold conditions between the building and the shell and between the building mass itself. Yeah, and I also placed some glass volumes in between the building blocks to make sure that there's cover on the circulation paths and to just add another layer of complexity to the threshold conditions. And this is just a circulation diagram. So the first floor and the second floor both follows kind of like circular paths in terms of circulation. And moving on to the plans. So for my programs, the volumes on the outside are more considered as public space, such as the cafe and recitations and stuff. And the two volumes on the inside are semi-public. There will be kitchens and gaming rooms and like laundry spaces, and the entire second floor will be private space, which are bedrooms. And one thing I did with the shell was that I moved this facade entirely. And what I did was to add another layer of concrete facade on the exterior for structural support and to add insulations and stuff, since parts of my building does come in with the shell like direct contact. And this also allowed me to remain the brick characteristic on the interior of the building. And moving on to this is a section cutting horizontally through the central courtyard and through the overhanging space of the second floor over the cafe space. And this is a section perspective that's cut vertically. So this shows how like the different kind of relationship the brick wall has with the building. And this part will be the entrance of the building, which it comes in direct contact with the brick wall. And some other part would be separate, like providing kind of like an exterior courtyard space between the house and the brick wall. And these are just the two modules that all of my room follows. The top would be a 4-people bedroom and the bottom would be a 2-people bedroom. And for those modules, I basically was thinking about like kind of creating privacy while living really closely with each other. So this is just a render from the street view, which facing the cafe space and the main entrance of the building. And so those two are just two renders. The left one's showing the central core condition, which shows how different building blocks have a sense of transparency between them. And there's a central light well that kind of makes sure light can reach every single part of the building mass. And the right one is a render of the bedroom space. I'll move to the mirror board, which shows all the deliverables.
Nice. So Sharon, do you see the vertical circulation? Is that in the heart of the building, or are you doing that as a dispersed activity in your glass in connecting pieces? I'm not quite understanding quite where your vertical circulation is
so the vertical
living.
circulation is here in this diagram. It kind of doesn't really show, but it's among the main entrance space with the lobby and the receptions and stuff. Will be a single stair and an elevator.
And is there another stair on the other side of the building, or is that the only one?
That's the only one, but all the spaces are connected.
Right. Well, you have certainly thought about the furniture, the furnishings, the occupation of every inch of this site. I'm really interested in the way you have a dialogue between what is the fenestration of the old brick wall and the new concrete lining that you're putting behind it, which apart from the main entrance and the axial view all the way through, is, oh, there's an opening on the other side. I see. So you're trying to establish the connection street to street through the middle of the building, yes?
Yeah, I guess so. So I added a concrete layer, and also this part of the wall is newly placed, which kind of also frames the space and like add to the material palette.
In concrete again?
In concrete, yeah.
Yeah.
So, oh, go ahead.
Go for it, Ken.
I was just going to ask then, but it looks like part of your new intervention though it was represented as brick or masonry, right? Is that, and what's the intent of that? Just while we were talking about material.
Yeah, so the brick of the entire house itself is mainly built out of brick, but with like another color or like a material like texture as the brick facade, which was just to kind of resonate with the old facade and also to kind of like tie in with the Pittsburgh community, since most of the neighborhood housing are made out of bricks. But I also want to make a distinction between the wall and like the newly built concrete walls.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, we can take this further, because I don't read this building that you've rendered with the plan that you've, or the diagram of the discrete pieces and their tails and their separations. I feel that what you're drawing is something much lighter than this kind of huge weight cantilevering across the street in the material which is solid. So for me, I've lost my sense of the dialogue between your insertion and its shell. On the left-hand side of this render, there's just the one opening on the street, and the traces that presumably are all be there of the facade of the factory that has disappeared are not being kind of imagined. And so I'm sort of we read plans and make all sorts of assumptions, and my assumptions aren't fulfilled in this in this render. So there's something lighter about what you're suggesting in your partie. Can you see that? Sort of.
I agree, Mary Lou. I was surprised by the rendering. When it got to the rendering, it seemed different to what I had in
your
my
head,
mind.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I second that, and but I even when I got to the section, so I actually want to, and I think this is where the vertical question came up, because and I think the courtyard, the section perspective starts to get there, but there's a sophistication in the plan in terms of the way that you're putting space together and the way that you are putting creating a very distinct relationship between new and old. And I'm not as convinced by kind of wrapping the brick in the concrete. I'm not sure that is necessary for the scheme, but it might have been necessary to you. But in the plan, there's a just a level of detail and clarity in terms of how that goes together that I was kind of longing to see that in the section, which then would translate, I think, to the rendering. So, and I think the partie is so clear, but it is mostly a plan partie too, and I think that's part of why, I think how those interlock vertically, I think
structurally,
a really important piece of the puzzle to kind of let the section gain the sophistication. And I think sometimes that's as simple as just you put those drawings next to each other and you're like, all right, which one am I happier with, right? And if they're not equal, then you keep going. Does that make
yeah, I see. So I feel like one of the reason why this doesn't really match up is because one of the main problem I had while I was developing the plan was, since there's like a lot of kind of like openings to the street, so it was kind of hard to distinguish which part was the main entrance and which part are not supposed to be as open to the outside. So as a result, I kind of had to close up some parts, which in the render like kind of reduce like the lightness of the building itself.
But in the plan, it looks as if you've thought so clearly about the structure that's running through the two floors. You've got it on a kind of regular, rhythmic, peripheral wall structure. That I'm just kind of surprised that it doesn't then become legible in the section. It's just how lost the sense of where the bearing is happening and how that is taken through. One thing that is very enjoyable about your sectional proportions is that you have a street level which has got a scale to it which is so markedly different to the upper level, and that I enjoy that sense of public realm that you've achieved through that means.
I would second that. I think there's a kind of shifting that happens in your plan that doesn't make it into this section. I think the more I look at the two, there's kind of things that move past each other a little bit more. And I think you're just starting to get into that kind of along the edges of the courtyard and at the other edge, but it's not, it never quite finishes. Cause there's, you know, I think these rooms and the way that you're just, I think there's a clarity to your partie and your approach that I actually very much enjoy, you know, where you're not trying to do too much. You're trying to just kind of get a lot of experience out of, you know, really a restricted palette and restricted moves, which I think is an admirable way to try to do this. It's a difficult way to do it though. So I think that we talked a little bit in the last conversation about, you know, using the rendering. I think this is a great example of where, you know, you're saying, well, I need to look at how to make an entry. And so I think that's where you really want to work fluidly back and forth. And you want to look in this image and say, all right, so how do I make that, you know, how do I just design in this, you know, you sketch over that, and then you think about what the ramifications are in plan, and you kind of work those back and forth very fluidly as you can, to kind of, you know, allow that dialogue to happen. Yeah, the rendering for me is where I'm really convinced that I really wish that wall on the left was just brick, because I think then compositionally it's then I'm like, yeah, your entrance is in exactly the right place. So.
I just want to commend your plans. Your plans are so clear graphically and so kind of proportionally settled, and just you created a lot of little idiosyncratic moments in them, but then you resolved everyone. They're just very sophisticated for second year. And I do agree. The same thing with the rendering was it did feel a little jarring and different. And I guess maybe I was expecting to match some of the aesthetic of these little pods. It's actually really impressive that you went from the level of resolution in the plan down to a level of aesthetic resolution in those detailed pods, and that somehow that didn't quite like permeate its way into the overall building at this moment. Mm-hmm. But I think you have a real nice sensibility about the design.
Sorry to cut you here, but I think we need to wrap up now. So we are gonna be assigned to another breakout room for the students that are presenting in this session. Please don't exit this room. The rest of us will be reassigned. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys.
Okay.
Hello.
Here we are. Okay. So I see Jeff, I see Lori. Let's see. And for the students, so Amal,
What's here? Yeah.
Olivia, Jackson, Amias. Okay.
Nick's here.
Nick, okay. Cool.
All right. So we're ready.
Okay, good for me.
So Amal, do you want to take control?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm starting the timer.
Okay.
Can you see my screen? Okay. So when I was approaching this project, I saw the shell as an object covering or sheltering the interior space. And so I wanted to create a new object that kind of protruded out of the shell and had in an unexpected manner. So that created a diagonal shift, which also shifted the entire circulation. So as you enter, you enter from the front, and you follow the diagonal path that is that's created by the outdoor seating, as well as the new exterior wall that's shifted. And then you can either you can either continue straight into the exterior courtyard. Sorry, one moment.
Straight out of Compton. The straight story. Straight out of Oakland. You want to hear the next 5?
Sorry, my iPad started picking up what I was speaking. So basically, you can enter into the building through this compression area, which is created by the 2 walls. You can see it in the rendering I created. So as you enter, you follow the diagonal path that leads you to the lobby or reception area, and the cafe, which is the public space, or you can continue going backwards or towards the end of the building, which is where more of the semi-private spaces are. The bedrooms and private areas are on the top floor, which as you enter, you can go to from the main staircase, which leads you upstairs, or you can exit into the exterior courtyard. The design has 3 separate courtyards. One of them is the more public, which is connected to the entrance, or the semi-private courtyard, which is sheltered by the shell, but is also more public, as it the brick shell has openings and is accessible through the cafe as well. And then there's a more private courtyard in the back of the building. So the center of I saw the center of the new shell as more of the gathering spaces and public spaces, which is carried through the second and the first floor. So the first floor has more of the public gathering spaces, and the top is more private, but it's still public gathering spaces as you walk through the bedrooms or the private areas. In my section perspective, it's looking towards the courtyard, as well as the more private kitchen area. I wanted to do this view just to highlight the gathering space. I have like a skylight at the top to emphasize the gathering space on the second floor, as well as highlight the semi-private outdoor gathering space.
Could you help me understand where your entry is?
Yeah, so due to the diagonal shift of the new building, the entry is, you can kind of see it on this path. You have to walk at the same angle as the rotation, and then you go into this compression area.
So could you point to it on your plan? Because I think I'm understanding it, but
so like here, and then you can walk into here.
okay. And I was hoping you were going to say that, but then I was also confused because I was looking at your keys and you have 2 number 1s called lobby that sort of suggested those were like reception desks. So I got confused about what I would experience once I've entered, I guess.
This is the lobby, and then this is the kitchen. That's a 7.
Oh, okay. I couldn't see it closely enough. Thank you. So, but I would come in, here, I'm going to annotate. So I'd come in here.
Mm-hmm.
And
this
then,
is all covered.
And then, so I would still be outside, right? So if it was winter, I'd still be cold there.
Yeah.
When would I get into
here.
Condition space? Okay, so I'd keep going through there.
Mm-hmm.
And then what?
This is the reception desk, but this is also like just seating for public use.
Okay.
And so can you zoom out a little bit and just describe that diagrammatic drawing there?
Yeah, so these are the the private bedroom spaces that are in the like entire new shell. And then this skylight is supposed to indicate the public gathering space that carries throughout the both floors.
And so how would you describe the diagram of the project beyond, you know, this type of space is here and this type of space is here, but how would you describe the kind of architectural organizing ideas of the project as maybe as described in that diagram?
Well, the building has a distinct rotation, so the spaces that are in like within the shell are like mostly facing outwards. So I thought of that as more of the like usable space, I guess.
Right. So the rotation has to do with kind of opening up those spaces out to the neighborhood in some way.
Yeah.
So so where does that experience happen in the best way, I guess? What are the most important parts of that condition? Yeah, I see the entry there, and the stair kind of projects through, and
like most of the like entry points, or each like wall has a distinct entry point, so you can like, as you wrap around the private courtyard, has a entry point over there, and there's
and I'm not, you know, I'm just asking that so that I understand what the intentions of the project were, so we can, because part of this is like looking at whether the way the architecture got developed is telling the story of the intentions, right? So like if the rotation was about making the public spaces somehow more special, or maybe opening to the neighborhood in a different way. Just tell me how you think the success of that was, or whether that was the if that was the idea. I mean, just talk about that a little bit.
I think the idea was to have a new element that kind of protruded out of the courtyard, the existing shell, not necessarily to like highlight these spaces, but to kind of create circulation or provide a new path as you enter the new building.
Mm-hmm. And then how about the space in the back that's made, that the kind of triangular zone in the upper left-hand corner of the site?
Mm-hmm. That was more of a private courtyard space, as it's like completely blocked off. Honestly, that was kind of like with the whole like rotation aspect of the building, there was a lot of like difficulty with not having, I guess, like uninviting angles, which I don't think that courtyard necessarily has like reached that point specifically. But the purpose of it was to create more of a like privatized area,
mm-hmm.
and maintain the like angle created by the new shell.
Yeah. It might be interesting to like, how did you draw this? Do you have a Rhino model, or
Yeah.
Yeah. It would be interesting to maybe try to draw your diagram in the middle there, or even just keep everything in plan where it's supposed to be, not make it like a blow apart axon, but kind of highlight different elements of the project and see what kind of story they're telling. So for instance, the kind of core, which is the like the elevator and stair as the sort of leading nose, I'm going to call it, of the kind of rotation of your plan, right? Like that's the piece that's in the primary position of the rotation, right?
Mm-hmm.
When it what happens when you draw the stair and the elevator and add that into the diagram, right? Now all of a sudden, kind of the vertical circulation pieces are in that really key spot. So
mm-hmm.
what might that tell you about the scheme, or how might that inform things? The fact that the basic plan configuration of the piece that you've added, it's almost the same size as the rectangle of the brick box.
Mm-hmm.
So that implies, if I'm looking at that as an architectural, this is almost like a movie script, right? Reading an architectural diagram. So if I see that, what I'm imagining happened is that all that stuff was inside the box, and then it kind of swung around and broke through the wall and kind of landed in the spot where it is now, right? If all of your stuff was not precisely the same size as the brick box, I wouldn't maybe necessarily automatically assume that it used to be inside the box and now has swung out. But you make the decision to make it the same size, and now it looks like it's pulled out. And so now all of a sudden, maybe the point of the rotation of like, where's the rotating point where all that stuff has been pulled out, maybe begins to be an important thing. So I'm not saying any of these I'm not suggesting that you do that, or that that's a piece to add to the plan. What I'm suggesting is finding additional information to add on to the diagrams in order to see what the implication of this move is beyond just kind of plan geometry, right? It feels a little bit like it's sort of playing with 45-degree angles on the plan, but there's probably more to that action that could be that could start to inform additional layers of the project.
And sorry, like 4 minutes warning.
Yeah, I would like to have seen a view somewhere from over here that caught something about that edge, because that rotation relative to the original box sort of resulted in conditions that I think warranted more study, or maybe had more opportunity. And this one I'm willing to like kind of forego for the moment, although I think that's kind of a shame. But these are really important, right, because of their presence on the street there. And exactly what Jeff said, that stair and elevator, depending on how you treat that, could be it could be very closed off. It doesn't necessarily need to be, but it would sort of take a lot of effort to have it engage the street properly. So in a way, you were sort of clever to stick to this view and not swing around. But those other edges deserve some thought and treatment. And then I think I understand what you're saying, Jeff, about the diagrammatic kind of study that it warrants. You know, even if you start to think about this as less of a single box, and more like you sort of showed it here, where there's sort of bars of space, to start to explore what those bars do, both structurally, spatially, what their sort of daylight axis are. There's very different conditions you've created by pivoting those bars the way that you did. And I think each of those zones of space could maybe have a different architectural result.
Yeah, the bars show up in the diagram over
Definitely in the diagram
over on the side.
Yep.
I mean, let's see if I can draw. So, you know, this guy here, this is kind of a nice little thing here. Now, if I'm imagining that all that what had been at one point in the conception of this thing, inside here, right? And maybe the bar was inside, or do an undo. Okay. Oops, sorry. Went too far. Maybe that bar was on the outside, right? We're not trying to necessarily redesign your project here, but what now all of a sudden there's kind of a space that is inside the the original box, right? Here's which is this space here. And so that feels like, that feels like a pretty good response to this box, right? And it doesn't all fit. That's part of the point of this project, is that all of this stuff in the program doesn't fit in the box. Something's got to move outside. So you've got a bar that's kind of sticking outside. Now you have a space out here. And so if you begin to rotate parts of this, then as Lori said, that's beginning to affect that outside space. So I guess the point of this conversation is to just make sure that you're cognizant, because I think, if you look at some of your plan moves and some of the spaces that you're making, there's some very nice, interesting spaces in there. So just make sure that you are registering these things, that you don't lock yourself into a kind of a single type of reading of the project, where it's really only about kind of the plan, maybe bringing some different angles to the plan. And sometimes it's helpful to step back from the project and say, yeah, what happens if I if I imagine this not just as the kind of perimeter outside shape, but if what is this thing made of? It's made up of a bunch of bars, or it's made up of you know, I don't know, whatever else. Maybe it's a kind of a zigzag through the box or something, right? How else can I imagine the kind of intuitive moves that I'm making, and to see what the story of that diagram might be.
The 3D renderings have a nice kind of illustrative vibe to them. They're not like super realistic, but there's kind of a nice, like, I feel like you could accomplish some nice architectural resolution to the big moves.
And this is a nice elevation out, you know, this, I mean, this looks like pretty nice.
For section perspectives, especially ones that go kind of non-orthogonal, it'd be really helpful for us. Like, I think it's kind of there, but it'd be really helpful for us to draw a line on your plans to understand where you're taking that section.
Thank you, Mal.
Thank you.
I think we can move on to Olivia.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Hi.
And I'll share my screen.
Thank you.
Can you all see?
Yeah.
Okay. So my approach toward the hostel project. So I think while the existing old wall encloses a space that's long abandoned, my project aims to give the old a new identity by revitalizing the space in the local community and kind of encouraging interactions between community members and hostel residents. And the hostel keeps most of the shell to frame the internal hostel community, while the new structure expands outward to engage with the neighborhood. So here's the floor plans. So the first floor is for communal areas with cafe and lobby on the most exterior and open to the public. And moving inward, the central square allows space for social interactions and gatherings. And what's wrapping around the central square is dedicated to the public rooms, such as the game room and reading room, dining room, and also other spaces for that has seats for gathering. And then the existing brick wall begins to define kind of a corridor that creates a dialogue between the old wall and the new, and forming an L shape corridor that connects all the communal spaces at the first floor, and all compact sleeping spaces are raised above the existing brick wall, developing into four types that includes the capsule types on the second floor. So the capsule type fosters, I guess it fosters the hostel's shared quality, and which is connecting to other rooms with 4 beds and 2 beds by this like corridors wrapping around the central square. And yeah, and a rooftop and is accessible to the second floor and of the hostel members, and it has open views to the outside. And yeah, that's it, my project.
Can we look at the plans?
Yes.
Can you look over on at the second floor plan there a little bit? Maybe I need to move my pictures. Yeah, never mind. Just zoom in a little bit there.
Oh, I don't know if I can zoom in here, but it's the mirror board. It's a bit laggy. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm on the mirror board. I'm trying to look at that too. I'm having, is the corridor that wraps around the perimeter, that's interior space, correct?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand, do the suites of, actually, yeah, the suites of bedrooms, do they have windows? Can they have a view in daylight?
Yeah, they have windows. I think it's showing this rendering here, and balconies. That brings relationship to the wall.
Oh, so that's not a continuous corridor around the perimeter. There's a little, it's just a little bridge over.
Yeah.
I see.
It's more of an offset. There is the courtyard corridor, and then there is the offset from the shell.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so your graphics have a really beautiful quality to them, but they're not. It's a little inconsistent from drawing to drawing. Like in some ways, like in some of your drawings, like your exterior 3D view, you have the existing shell rendered as red, and then the new as white, and that's actually kind of a useful tool to help me understand what's what. But then the plans, I don't have that same clarity. I'm sort of really working hard to understand.
Yeah,
what's interior and exterior space plans.
Mm-hmm.
Where does the shell start and stop? So if I'm looking at that wall between the lobby and the inner courtyard there, yeah.
Yeah, it stops here.
All right, so that's it, and then it
like
keeps
this.
going, right, and then it
over there.
But then, yeah, I keep trying to understand in this project, and Lori, I don't know what your sense is. If it's a if the difference between existing and new, the kind of clarity of drawing the original brick box, which basically nobody does, right? Which hardly any of the projects do. And last year when we did this project, it was the same thing. I keep trying to understand if that is a specific, intention of the students, or if that is or if it's, how that, what that means. Maybe you can answer, Olivia, sorry.
Do you mean this corridor space?
Yeah, because is the relationship of what you're adding to the new brick box, how do you understand that dialogue or the importance of that in the project?
I guess so. In the floor plan, you can see my programs are
They're all, they're set within.
Yeah, the existing wall is wrapping around them, and then
then what happens up in the upper right hand corner then?
Upper right hand.
Yeah.
Oh, it's circulation and other mechanical rooms.
Right, but what's going on with the relationship of the existing box there? How do you conceive of that of that sort of piece within the diagram of the? See what I'm saying? Like there's, we're just asking that you just conceptually in the project, because there's a bit of an arbitrariness to the point where the existing brick box stops or is kind of cut into.
I'm sort of confused from the 3D view that is looking from the street back toward the brick box, and for some reason I've lost my annotate tool here. But
sorry, which one?
But what the very first slide, yeah.
Okay.
That white box that comes out towards us, it really feels like it would be a bar that would be at the top of your plans, extending left and right on the page. So when you go down to your plans on the second slide, It feels
Yeah.
like the brick box ends and there's only like a little tiny bit of bar that extends, whereas in the 3D view, it's a much longer. Maybe there's something forced about their perspective or something, but I'm struggling to kind of connect the 2D and the 3D information. Don't know why yet, so I can't quite.
Yeah.
I think because maybe one reason is because the brick wall is actually cut back a fair bit. The drawing makes it look like the white bar is jamming into the side wall, but it's actually going deep into the plan of inside the brick.
I get. Oh yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think there's early comments too about the color, right? The kind of depending on your monitor, but that kind of purplish color, the legibility of that actually starts to present more difficulties than it does, than it is particularly decisive. Even in this rendering where it starts to bleed across the street. I think maybe the closest reading of the project is that kind of stacked massing axon that you had later in the presentation.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that one. Yeah, I mean that starts to bring more clarity to it.
Right. And I guess the very first slide, I was very excited about the first slide because it was this kind of old red brick box, and it was this new like Richard Meyer clean white box, and I thought that kind of juxtaposition was going to kind of be.
Yeah, it looked like that was going to keep playing out all through the project, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm either like continuing to look for it and not finding it, or I'm stymied by the graphics. Maybe that was an intention, but I think that there was something really beautiful in that, and the rendering that you have of the little slot space with the brick wall on the left and the kind of hall, there on the left side of the screen there, that's got a nice opportunity for that juxtaposition too of old and new, but I'm struggling to kind of see that in some of the big moves. I'm seeing it in little moments or consistently again.
But that's I think getting. I don't think I was being very clear, but the relationship between the way the project is drawn and the conceptual understanding of the project and this kind of brick bounding box, it's important for the students to understand that when we're talking about the drawings or things we don't quite see in the drawings, it's because it feels as though the project is about certain types of connections between that old box and the new stuff, where that as an idea would chase through the design, but also be represented clearly, even as simply as the original brick wall is drawn red and the new stuff is drawn white or something like that. But don't confuse that with simply a kind of graphics comment, right? It's a comment about making sure that the conception of the architecture is clear and that the way it's represented it should follow that, but it's the conceptual part that's the important part.
Right.
It's interesting because your drawings kind of show where it is clear and where it's not, right? Like with the set of boards, I mean, you almost kind of want to start to edit into, these are the things that make sense, meaning they seem to be making a consistent proposition. And these are the things that haven't been entirely figured out yet, right? So the kind of the mean part of some of the reading of your drawings is they're confusing and they tend to contradict with some of the other things we think we feel. The other side of that would be you can kind of use the pathology of the drawings to confirm the things you really understand and the things you don't quite. And then, with enough time, you figure out what to do about that.
Yeah, I agree.
All that said, there's something, I mean, the interior, when it's kind of this white and wood space, there's a nice lightness to it. That courtyard feels like a nice, in your section, that one, it's a nice proportion. It actually feels like it could work as a courtyard for the most part. Although I was looking at the plans, that's part of why I was trying to understand what those perimeters were, both the outside and the interior. Is the reading room and game room and the dining will kind of activate that courtyard. But but then there's also a lot of service stuff that's solid against that courtyard that might not allow for that space to be as activated as it could be. And similarly up on the second floor, that's what I was trying to understand, sort of where daylight was and where circulation was, because those bedrooms feel like they don't have that opportunity to connect, for either daylight or views or activity, or there's kind of there's the barrier of circulation, or there's the barrier of void space between those bedrooms and any kind of outdoor space.
4 minutes warning.
How did you decide to put the stacked third floor piece on the quote unquote backside of the site compared to the front of the site?
Because I guess that's because of the exterior view. So just showing clearly how these are different. One is the old and a new construction coming out. So I guess that's the reason why I put it on there instead of here.
So you wanted to group that with the other new stuff, and you wanted to kind of maintain a clarity of the original brick. Mm-hmm. So does the amount of cutting or the amount of alteration that you do to the sidewall, how does that enter into that conversation?
The cutting into the sidewall?
Mm-hmm.
I just decided to cut the brick wall there because as an entrance, to align with the entrance into the courtyard. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious about your rooftop terrace too. I noticed you did some stepping, and I assume that's for seating opportunities. But it's also articulated on the front facade. It's broken in particular locations. Is that is it kind of a design feature for the architecture, or is it more just an inherent change in level for seating?
Oh, I designed because first of all I want to create to indicate where the entrance is, and also kind of creating different platforms at a little bit different level change, and seatings. Yeah, seating tension. And see a little bit here and here.
In a way, it seems to me that your project is also a lot about offsetting the taller volume from the street, from the facade. It could be that a different, like from this image exactly. Maybe if you could take one from up above, you would probably show this like step up better. And I know that we discussed the openings, and the new openings were kind of a memory of the existing openings. I don't know, maybe that's something that we could have worked on a little more, and capturing more of this strategy that you had.
It's also a very generous seating area or roof. You have it called out as rooftop seating area on your plans. So it's a very generous space for what's maybe, I don't know, 12 or 20 people or something up there. So it feels kind of very commercial instead of sort of intimate. It maybe, I know you needed the roof over that cafe space, but maybe
not all.
Yeah, maybe there was just one little spot where it was occupiable and the rest of it was just planted, or there was something different about that. So you could have kind of structured that a little differently, so it could be just roof in some places instead of seating everywhere.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, if there are no other comments, thank you, Olivia. We can see Jackson.
Thank you, Olivia.
Okay, thank you.
Hey everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes, we can.
All right, I'll go ahead and share my screen. Is that showing up?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, hey everyone, my name's Jackson. So for my presentation, I'm going to start with this street view. So the intention here was for my project to kind of, for the intervention to be of a sort of different nature than the brick shell in order to kind of preserve the legibility of that profile, and sort of respect it as kind of an artifact of the neighborhood. So it's kind of set back from both the top and the bottom of those edges, so they kind of read as they do currently, and then the new form is kind of nestled within that shell and extends out only on the ground floor very intentionally as kind of an invitation to the public in a way. So the public kind of is brought into that innermost scheme through the protrusion and then kind of moves upward to the private rooms. There's kind of a distinction between that publicness and the privateness of the two parts of the program. So moving on to the plans, I guess, we can see this kind of first floor is intended to be very open and freely usable by the public and the hostel residents. So the intention here is that some of the less important service elements of the program are kind of contained in these structural boxes that kind of hold up the upper floors. So like, I'm imagining this construction to be some kind of stereotomic heavy masonry that kind of mimics the language of the walls and kind of houses things like the cafe, bike sharing, the laundry, things that wouldn't necessarily be so important, the elevator, and then the rest of the space kind of flows in a ring around it, which contains more of the gathering spaces, the social spaces that would be most inhabited, and that kind of extends into the courtyard as well, which is sort of the central innermost sanctum of the project. And then in the axon, you can kind of see this idea that the upper two floors are intended to be a kind of different beast entirely. They house the private residential rooms, and they're kind of, instead of about openness and horizontal, they're more closed, opaque, and they're about sort of retreat almost. They're kind of like elevated off the ground and kind of further define that horizontal nature of the ground floor. Moving on to those floors plans, you can kind of see the intention here was to treat the rooms as sort of modular boxes that can be kind of fit together in any number of ways. And the way I approached them was through kind of variations on a type. So the program brief called for a couple of different kinds of rooms. Some of them are 4-person, some are 2-person. And based on those requirements, as well as whether or not they have a bathroom, things like that, they're all sort of just slightly altered so that they can kind of fit together like puzzle pieces. Another way you can look at it is sort of in this diagram where the beds, desks, closets are kind of added into a thickened wall condition rather than thinking of them as separate rooms. So it's almost, you can kind of read these plans as a rhythm of solid and void where the space from the courtyard can kind of be invited into those rooms, and then you can inhabit the walls adjacent to them. So there's a kind of logic that structures these two floors. Again, the consequence of, I guess, having these two dissimilar approaches is that you achieve, again, a very horizontal, open nature of the ground floor that's punctuated by these two vertical moments of the courtyard and the stair. You can kind of see here that the stair is a bit of a main moment of the project because it's kind of parallel along this southernmost wall, which is kind of almost a datum, not really, but a sort of delineating device separating the public from the private in this project. So from one side entering, you kind of experience that brick texture of the wall through kind of a light screen where light from the south can kind of bounce down into that little area and illuminate this public volume. But then passing through this opening in the wall to the innermost part of the project, you kind of experience that wall texturally instead, and then you move up it into the private rooms. And then one last image kind of showing again that the intent of the stairs to kind of place you in an intense moment of betweenness, sort of between the existing texture of that kind of rough wall and then the newly defined space that's been created adjacent to it. All right, so I guess we can move to the Miro board now.
Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
The stair that's shown in the top left rendering, though, that's the one that's on your first. Okay. Oh, I see it now on the first floor plan. So, and then that second stair that's back in that slot. I guess what's the reason for that stair? Is that just for egress?
Yeah, that's sort of
Okay.
more of a practical, like egress stair. It's not as
Yeah.
important.
Okay.
The thought about inhabiting thickened walls that happens higher up in the building. Do you think that's do you think that persists all the way down to grade? And if it does, could you walk us through maybe that set of relationships? And if it doesn't, you can just say, no, it doesn't.
Okay, yeah. So the intent there was that that's kind of how the residential rooms are structured. So I wouldn't say that it extends down to the ground floor, but it was kind of intended to delineate the two separate realms of the project. So it's like kind of a different style of organizing space than on the ground floor.
Yeah. So it's kind of an organizing device or a kind of way you're thinking about where things go rather than actually a solid thing that kind of manifests itself tectonically and runs through the building.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, that's a good way to put it.
How were you thinking about the relationship of your addition to that outdoor space on the corner, or just even the amount of the amount of porosity or what would get located in that piece of the plan? I mean, I can certainly see the glazed wall here on this corner. And then I guess I'm wondering a little bit about the rest there, the kind of all the service stuff.
Yeah, I'm wondering the same about the decision of that when you have a lot of kind of dark opportunities back there.
Well, yeah.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely, I think, something I struggle a lot with about whether the degree of transparency I guess both of these walls should have. And this, I don't like try to presume that this is a final definition by any means, but I do think that it was just important to me to have some sort of highly transparent degree of openness on that ground floor somewhere. And then I kind of sacrificed the openness on one wall in order to contribute more to that circulation ring idea, and that the sort of service areas could branch off of that, even if it is admittedly somewhat to the detriment of the openness down there.
Well, what I think what it does is it's kind of presuming that the important focus of the project is kind of internal, right? Which is what you're doing. You're making a kind of centralized open space. And there's a kind of ring around it. And so there's only so much room we've got on the site. So that kind of begins to dictate a bit that some of the service stuff, some of the solid stuff becomes the kind of outer edge. So if one has to kind of coordinate that with an idea about how much the project is inviting the public into that central space, and this is a hostel, so it's not a technically public building. You have to be staying here, I suppose. But that's an interesting set of things to have to wrestle with, right? We've said this on a few projects. There really isn't enough room for all the program to fit inside the box, and you want a centralized thing. So something's got to pop out. So what does that mean in a centralized scheme?
Right.
What does that do to the neighborhood, et cetera? So that's kind of an interesting set of things. You know, maybe it's still working towards a full resolution, but that's an interesting set of problems to deal with.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think that some of those planning decisions relate to how important this centralized, right? If that is a centralized space and it is important, then you need to start to think about how you occupy the space as you kind of move towards it. And there's this kind of like, I go here, but then I have to kind of like hook a left and like squeeze my way through. There's kind of all of these like impediments and narrowness to it. So I think that some of those sort of second, right, this was your first decision, right, this kind of courtyard and this kind of box within a box,
Right.
but those next tiers of decisions are really important for how you execute
Mm.
or how you kind of maintain the integrity of that big decision. And
Right.
I'm really kind of thinking about occupying this space, right? So if I'm at this cafe, that's maybe a really nice cafe, but I kind of only have an opportunity to kind of engage with that view because I'm looking at, you know, where they flip the burgers here, and I'm looking at this wall, and I have no opportunity to get with the courtyard. I don't know. I'm wanting to kind of rearrange some things to bring back the clarity of your first big move because I think there's a strong big move there.
I see. Okay.
And I'm really kind of curious. This was something that a lot of my students did last semester. This sort of very narrow. What's the thinking behind that really narrow slot space?
Yeah. So both that and the one on the back entrance are kind of intended to be a bit of a moment to like kind of preserve the original reading of the wall. It's not entirely so much a lived in spatial moment right there. It is pretty narrow. So kind of assumed it would be almost a secondary entrance where you kind of slip between the new and the old and kind of just enter the building. It's like, I guess I could think of it as more of a moment of passage, sort of transitory thing rather than something you would want to stay in.
So are these totally open, like I could walk through any of these, or are those glass or what?
Oh, that's just the original facade of the building. So it's
right. So are you keeping it as windows, or are you leaving it as a passage, or what are you?
I'm kind of leaving them entirely open. Sort of that's just like an outdoor moment right there.
So it's like a loggia. You could walk through any of those openings.
Yeah, in a way, kind of.
It starts to feel like more. It starts to feel almost more like an entry, or well,
yeah.
Except they're not really lined up. I mean this, but then it's just a bike room. I don't know. There's a.
Yeah, I mean, especially because if the central space is the important piece,
right?
You
kind of
which
right
I mean, if you think about making a making a kind of internalized, whoops, keep moving on me. If you think about making an internal space the important heart of the project, right? And you know, we're inside of a rectangle, right? So that's saying, okay, the act of kind of getting into that is the important heart of the project, right? This is like a this is almost like a little temple space or something, right? You have, so the idea of kind of layers to get into that can make some sense because there's a series of thresholds that you cross in order to get to the almost sacred space in the center, right? That begins to imply that the box wants to hold some you know, legibility so that you understand that as a central space. And if we get back to our original problem that, yeah, you can't fit everything in here. Okay, so we've got a thing out here, and maybe this is made up of bars of your service stuff, but it's because this is kind of the that almost temple-like act of kind of getting into that central space, right? It confuses it a little bit if all of a sudden the you know, a big, grand, glassy kind of corner space here, that idea maybe begins to imply that the important space might be something more like that.
I see. Yeah.
You know, these are just, again, these are just conversations about ways of conceiving architectural diagrams, right? Like ways of conceiving, organizing architecture. So, you know, yeah, you know, putting the space inside the middle means you don't get to see it right away. It's not something that is like, you know, visible from 3 blocks away and is a big public thing. It's like it's a kind of a discovery, which could be really awesome. Quiet and meditative and all of that. So yeah, you know, then just think about how the other pieces help to tell that story.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I see.
And I think that's why diagrams are a part. I feel like I've had this conversation a lot with my students this semester too, where there's a misunderstanding that diagrams are this kind of thing that you do after the fact to just kind of document something, but it's really an integral part of the process. If you can diagram it, it can help to bring clarity to what your essential things are and what your priorities are. And so what Jeff was just drawing, even that move, right? Like if that isn't the story you're wanting to tell, but it appears in your diagram, then you have to resolve that conflict, you know. Or if there's something about upstairs, your plans are fairly, I won't say exactly symmetrical, but they're sort of centrally balanced, right? You know, so if this, like, then like, why isn't it balanced? Is it intentional that it's not balanced? Like what is even that angle about? Those kinds of abstractions, right? Diagrams kind of subtract information and leave just the very essential information. You have to make sure that that essential information is telling the story that you want it to tell.
Okay, I see.
So we're like 30 seconds left. Sorry, I didn't.
No worries.
The renderings are nice. The section perspective is there's kind of a nice amount of realism or color.
It's move.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Jackson. And if there are no other questions, I think Amy is next.
Yes. All right, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice project.
Thanks.
Okay. Can everyone hear me fine?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right. So I'll go ahead and share my slides. Similarly to Jackson's project, mine is sort of about preserving the form of this existing brick shell and inserting new forms into it. And in terms of my project, these forms begin to penetrate the shell and emerge and negotiate the experience between being within the shell and outside of it. So my hostel has 2 entry points. The first is through the existing fenestrations of the building, and those open up to the hostel's reception and an elevator to the upper floors, and then a corridor to the rest of the first floor that passes through the interior courtyard. And the other entrance to the hostel is through the volume that emerges out into the intersection on Vineal Street. And this serves as the main entrance. Once you enter through that, it sort of holds the most public aspects of the program with the bike rental and cafe, and slowly turns into more programmatic elements about the hostel residents, mentioning, well, including the kitchen and dining room, and the game room and whatnot. So there are 2 points of circulation. One is situated on the interior of the building, providing a stair core to the sleeping spaces above. And the main stair to the upper sleeping quarters of the hostel becomes a figural element. And I'll go back to this one just because you can sort of see it the best. And it branches itself across the outside of the brick structure to the upper sleeping levels. And this serves to create a threshold space through its overhang into the opening of the courtyard. And the experience within these 2 sort of elevated catwalks is one of prospect, with them both sort of containing only one very intentional window to look out onto the surrounding neighborhood. And so the requirement for privatized sleeping space with a bathroom connected to it made me think about how, and especially it being a hostel, how different sleeping spaces could be negotiated within the building. So I've developed 2 sort of typologies of the sleeping space. On the sort of bottom of this plan drawing, you see a more enclosed room that has 2 bunk beds and a bathroom connected to it. And then on the long side of the plan, there are 3 pods that fit 6 beds each. And the idea behind this is that on this side, the sleeping spaces are condensed, and in between those private areas. So I'm going to move on to this exploded axon. So I've sort of used these 2 bedroom types to define the facade of the interior, where on the side where the enclosed rooms are, it serves as a wall openings. And on the side where the more public sleeping area is, per se, the spaces are defined by the openings rather than, or defined by the sort of negative as the private. So these 2 sort of serve as an inverse of each other, right? The interior facade, and then just highlighting also the windows on these 2 catwalk stairways. And then the last 2, and okay, so we have a section perspective, which sort of to show the sort of the different experiences of being within this stair that moves up across the outside that allows you to look out, and then the public upper floors that sort of allow views into the courtyard and to see the existing brick structure. And these are 2 sort of experiential views. One sort of first walking into the courtyard that allows you to see the 2 different types from the outside, and then a view from within the first floor that shows the brick structure sort of acting as the negotiator between the public and more private space. So I'll switch over to Miro now.
I have a clarification question about the program. Is the bike component a public component? Like, is it a bike rental or is it a bike storage for the
bike
hospital?
rental?
Rental.
Okay. I misunderstood that.
Yeah.
So I thought it was more of just like a locker room for bikes. but it is meant to be a public thing. Okay. So I love the big curve. Like I think a lot of the other projects have been very orthogonal, and I love the big gesture of that, and it's kind of got a nice proportion and a nice feel to it. I really wanted to see like what happened as a result. So you have a courtyard there, but your graphics feel like November on a gray day. There's like no life, no vegetation, no people. Like I'm really, really yearning to see how cool that courtyard could be, because I think it could be really cool. But I don't know if you've even visualized it, which would be more concerning to me than you're just not showing it. Like, have you imagined what that courtyard could be? Because I think you've got the spaces and the right kind of organization around it to activate it, and it's like that curve is just sort of sticking out enough to like hint at wanting to pull me in.
Yeah.
But there's nothing there when I get there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've sort of into presentation. I kind of went with very neutral tonation to define the new structure, brick structure, black and white, to sort of signify that it still belongs to the neighborhood. And I kind of went along with that on the two additional drawings that begin to show the courtyard of the building. I think, yeah, I think including people interacting with the space would definitely help. I think I was more focused on continuing that idea from the first image into these two and sort of showing how the form presents itself and how it sort of interacts with that brick.
So this is something that we've been struggling together, like since the beginning of the project. You always had the curve, but then like the same problem that you kind of have in the courtyard. There is really no, I mean, it's a circulation space. It's like your free air hour. I mean, the same problem is also inside a little bit, like in the lobby and in the what you call the cafe area. I think there is still. It seems to me that there is like a missed opportunity a little bit of really taking, like giving a meaning to the curve, and that's something that we tried to push quite a bit at the beginning of the project. And I think honestly that the problem is not just like adding people to the imagery. There is like a bigger thing.
Yeah, it's a design thinking process question, which is, how do you envision human beings occupying and activating those spaces and bringing life to it.
Yeah, well, there were two things I thought were particularly strong with your presentation. One was kind of the plan itself, right? Just reading it. The other one was how clear it was what you did with the shell of the host building, right? That you kind of kissed up to the inside of that, and so we could kind of tell where it was and where it still was, and that there was a clarity about that. For the I have the same issue with the kind of the courtyard or the kind of internal plaza, and I think I'll suggest two things. So one is, even though you've heard, even though your plan has been complimented, I would caution you against reading too quickly that a line in the plan is coincident with a programmatic edge. I think you could do better to take some of your program elements and slide them through some of the lines you have in your plan, instead of kind of so literally where you draw an edge. That means that kind of that's cut off vertically, and that's a guillotine, and there's no way for something to slip out underneath something else. So that's one thing. The second thing is, if you go either to your exploded axon or what I think is your board number 3, that either one of those, or people can find it for themselves. But where I'm going to go with this is that these kind of scissor stair element things that you've got happening are they're really, really weak. I think they preclude the opportunity for that courtyard to be really strong. They completely deny the opportunity to provide any kind of facade or really give anything back to the street. They're just really, you know, for the strengths that we can read in your exploded axon, that's one piece, and it's actually rendered as a separate piece. It's the one piece I want to take away, and then not let you put back until it's kind of resolved and developed and really figured out. Even like the way you talked about the window or the windows that are in there, having those happen at the midpoint, kind of along the vertical circulation, as opposed to a true perch, where it seems, you know, like at a landing, you could really have that experience. It just seems really problematic and not all that well thought out. So I would suggest you take that piece away, take it back to your workshop, work on it really hard, and only bring it back to the project when it's kind of ready to go, and it even strengthens that plaza.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Paul mentioned. The staircase is not helping your curve that you have on the plan there. And if you did pull that off and reposition the stairs somewhere else to maybe further emphasize the curve and open up that section there, I think that path would be a lot more successful.
Then the little objects of the bedrooms are sort of an interesting thought about those being isolated objects and space in between. But again, I'm wondering what I'm looking at the second floor plan now. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the space in between there. Like, you haven't quite illustrated that. So I don't know if those zones belong to kind of everyone, or those zones belong to just those 2 beds or those 3 beds. It's not quite clear how it's occupied. And Mary Lou mentioned earlier, and I agree that you know, someone who maybe doesn't have the use of their legs would have you've kind of forced them to climb up into these bed pods, which I don't know that that's necessary to accomplish the kind of spatial idea you have. Those things could have just been their own like little node, even without the stairs. But there's
I mean,
yeah,
there's 2, so each of these has sort of 6 beds, so there's a set of 3 stacked on top of another set of 3.
Do you want to show imagery?
Oh, I missed that.
So let's see.
Oh, but it's 2 floors. Oh, so you actually just your second and third floor repeat.
Yeah, they repeat themselves.
Okay.
I'm gonna switch back to the slides just because it's not showing up on the Miro board. But
and we have 3 minutes.
Okay. You can sort of see in the section perspective that there's
those are those slot beds.
2 layers. Yeah.
The capsules. I see. I didn't understand that. When if you said it, I apologize, but what was your thinking about what the exterior material was for the new? So I'm looking now at I guess it's your 3rd slide, the exterior view from the street intersection. Where that scissor stair is very prominent above the courtyard. What was your thought about the material for that new? It's just kind of a monochromatic sepia tone in that.
Yeah. I was thinking about the construction of the overall building as a concrete frame, and I was focusing on sort of delineating material differentiation from especially the interior of the courtyard. I'll show the building and this idea of the 2 different room typologies in this interior facade as diagrams. So these would sort of be wooden volumes, and these would sort of be outlined with a wood frame on the sort of interior of it to sort of make them stand out within this overall shell.
When you were saying these and these, were you pointing to something? I didn't see.
Oh, sorry, I apologize.
Are you? I'm looking at the view from the street intersection toward your building, sort of from the southwest, I guess.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
I was referring to the third experiential view on the bottom right corner of the mirror board.
We're not seeing your mirror board then. I think we're
Yeah.
still seeing your slides.
Oh,
Slides, yeah.
I apologize. I was talking about this.
Okay, I was asking if you could go up to the third
Yeah.
slide. What were you proposing for the material here? I'll annotate this material here. What is
Yeah.
that?
I was proposing a concrete frame just to juxtapose the existing brick structure. Because the two are materially very different, and I wanted these volumes to sort of read as masses, and once you go inside, it sort of becomes framed out, but it sort of become materially, the brick reads as an aggregate form, and the concrete would read as these masses that are penetrating through.
It reads very heavy right now, and I'm not sure that's successful. I mean, aside from the sort of wonkiness of the shape of those, but but even this feels very heavy. I feel like it would maybe be more successful. It might be something you could try. You know, if you have that model, you could try modeling different materials and different kinds of expressions of those masses to test that out. But it feels very heavy right now, and I don't think that's working.
Well, that's an interesting way to think about it, Lori. Is I always encourage the students, because everybody's kind of learning about construction systems and materiality, and you know, that's just something that we all get better at later on down the road. But it's better to think about questions like that. Do you want those things to be light, or do you want them to be heavy? Do you want them to be anchored, or do you want them to be floating? Do you want them to be transparent or solid, right? Like forget the what it's made of for a moment.
Right. Start with the macro. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Amos. If anybody has more comments, but the time is up for
Thank
him.
you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And the last of our session is Nick Wong.
Hello.
But yeah, I'm sorry, everybody. I'm going to look at Nick's work for a minute, but then I'm going to have to jump off. I'm so sorry, but thank you all. It's been great.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Very nice to have you. Thanks.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. So my project kind of treats the existing walls as more of a shell that allows for an internalized scheme. My hostel consists of 3 main volumes within these walls, with the exterior courtyard spaces and circulation pathways between these 3 volumes. Each of these 3 volumes have their own public spaces, semi-public, communal lounge spaces, and private residential units. So for the first floor is mainly more public spaces that are kind of spread out between the 3 volumes. So there's the lobby, the cafe, and more public communal areas, and the kitchen. And they're kind of spaced between these exterior pathways that kind of weave in between the 3 volumes that also connect the courtyards with these 3 volumes. and there are two courtyards. There's one more central, um, uh, more public, and there's one that's more quiet, more secluded, and more private. That is only shared between two of the volumes. Um, the second floor contains more of the private residential spaces, um, and the arrangement of these residential units are kind of relatively sparsely spread out between these three volumes, which allows for these semi-public communal lounge spaces to exist between these residential spaces. And these lounge spaces are kind of they're very transparent, and they allow views throughout all three volumes. They connect the residential units to the courtyard spaces and allow um, these separate volumes to have their semi-public spaces to bleed into each other to kind of form this um, kind of central communal um, spatial quality to like how the these communal spaces are connected. The third floor is kind of more terraced. Um, it still has residential units, but only on the flanking volumes, and and the three volumes are still connected by terraces that kind of overlook the entire project and overlook the courtyard spaces, with the central volume having a very public, very transparent kind of game room, kind of lounge community space that could be a very flexible space to allow for meetings or whatnot. And the residential units, because they're spread out so much, they're kind. I had to modulize them, turn them into sort of mini cubicles. So I kind of created um, these beds with integrated desks and integrated shelves for more efficient spacing. And yeah, so here's a better example of what I mean by those connected communal spaces. So as you can see on like the first floor, you have the more public spaces, more kind of almost commercial on the volume on the right, and then more private, more kind of lounge on the left with the cafe in the middle. On the second floor, you can see how these residential volumes interact with these lounge spaces, and how those lounge spaces kind of blend the three volumes together, and how those communal spaces also the connect those communal spaces to the courtyard spaces. And here's a second sectional perspective to show the relationship between courtyard and one of the volumes. Um, there's two modes of circulation. They're both um, the uh, the main floor. Most of the circulation is exterior, which these kind of weaving pathways that go through the three volumes um, that connect the courtyard spaces with the three volumes. And the two stairs are located on the flanking volumes. The with the one in the middle being more of a like a intermediary public space on the first floor, and also more of a lounge space on the first floor. I mean, on the second floor as well, and a public game room on the third floor. And these are some renderings that kind of show the spatial qualities of uh, the courtyard space, how the uh, the project kind of interacts with the street. Um, and this one on the bottom left kind of shows the relationship between those public communal spaces to the courtyards, and the final render kind of shows the terraced third floor, and that very transparent, very public, flexible game room slash meeting room. And yeah, I will move to my mural board, and that's yeah.
I think it's a beautiful project. Beautiful graphics. It's really clear. They're sophisticated and complex spaces, but it's really clear. Um, like I'm not disoriented in any of your drawings. I actually understand what you're doing. I really appreciate the circulation diagram too. It's interesting. I was thinking about, I think a lot of the students last semester, when you did the houses and the threshold questions, you know, that we explored as a part of that, there was a lot of thinking about moving from interior space to exterior space, or having to transit through exterior space to get from one interior space to another, which I think in a house that you were occupying all the time kind of raises questions and concerns that are different here, because this is inherently transient, right? You're spending maybe just a few days here. You're not kind of occupying this space with the sort of permanence that you would in a house. So there's a way that these kind of interstitial spaces that you've created work in a way that normally I'd be a little bit skeptical of. But they work really well here, and there's a nice kind of like tenuous membrane it creates. And I think you've resolved it really well. My only kind of like, like, I wonder why, is it, I almost feel like the original brick box, you don't even need it. And I'm not sure that you really engaged with it purposefully. So in that like center section, here, I'll bring up my annotate, right, that I feel like the that's okay, especially because you left these as just kind of filled in, boarded in blanks of openings. I feel like this is the part that now I want to take away entirely, or because I know that probably would go against what you were supposed to do for the semester, or kind of jam this up against it and just kind of touch it or poke through it or do something to engage with it. But it kind of feels left behind with all of the architectural resolution you brought to all of this new construction.
Right. Yeah.
But otherwise, I think it's a really nice project. You did a really nice job.
Thank you.
Yeah, the set of the drawings, you know, as a set are really pretty rich. The drawing that's just up above the one that we're looking at, please, the section cut the other way. I do wonder about that a little bit, not because of what that presents as a drawing, because what that presents as a drawing is you know, fine. I have a couple of questions about a couple of things, but what I wonder is it because of, you know, the way you were playing with kind of camera angle or perspective or something? It seems like those three, and I presume you know what I'm meaning by the three, right? But it looks like those three aren't exactly the same, or they aren't necessarily the same, and then they're modified. It looks like they're similar rather than they're the same, and part of me wonders why they aren't the same, and then portions of them are kind of manipulated in order to get whatever you need out of each of them. And similarly, when we go to the plan, which I believe is to the immediate left of this image on the same board. Yeah, thanks. When we go to those plans, it becomes not impossible, but pretty hard to read the three. And so I'm wondering at what point kind of the three really matter and they're important, and so they're kind of established and then they're modified thereafter, or they're tuned thereafter, versus they kind of show up maybe perhaps the most emphatic in that section, and then they're harder to discover elsewhere in the presentation.
Right. So yeah, I did start out with three of the same, and they were modified to kind of so for example, like the first volume got a little bigger to suit like the lobby space more public because it fronts the street type of that kind of thing. And as I mean, I agree that the three don't really read in plan, and I mainly think it's because of the amount of because the I don't know if it's a representational thing, but it could be the glass that kind of makes the walls kind of read thin because of how transparent I made the first floor. And as for and I also think it's because of how they're connected in the middle that it kind of makes it seem more of a one unified shape instead of three separate volumes. So
yeah, it's interesting. It's, you know, I'll grant it's kind of an intellectual stubbornness, right? It's kind of, you want the partee to read a certain way.
right, yeah.
in whatever real life is. It's not like we're going to take a tape measure to those 3 volumes and find out whether they're within a 1/16 of an inch of each other, right? But somehow so experientially, the chances of us kind of really detecting that these things are exactly the same or that they're similar, they're going to be similar. But somehow this kind of intellectual want persists.
Yeah.
Well, and it goes back to kind of, it might be interesting for yourself to take a kind of pass at diagramming again, right? Not only in plan, but it's interesting what you said there about the section is that, right, you could start to begin to diagram in section too, right? How are these 3 things the same? How are they different? What are their kind of essential, their essential identities to each of those 3 parts? Is one more porous than the other? Is one more mass? Is one more frame? Are the material palettes literally the same? Or are they distributed in equal measure to all 3? Or are they distributed in different quantities to each?
Yeah, those are nice thoughts. Yes.
One thing that I think it's I don't know, it bothers me a little bit of these 3 guys is the one that is more towards the 6-way intersection, and it's basically it has this beginning of like twisting and relating to the neighborhood,
Right.
but then it gets straight up, and I'm like, I wish you would have gone like full rotation to occupy more of the plaza, making like a bolder statement right there at the corner where you need it. And then, like, I think that if you go to the view that captures the perspective view that captures that corner, the upper right, exactly. So one thing that it's a bit interesting is that you create this kind of like, so 2 entries, one that is like the glass storefront with an entry there to, I think is the cafe, I forgot what it is, but clearly like a public entry. And then there is like on the left this kind of corridor which is a bit awkward in plan because of the awkward shape, and I think that that's the most critical moment, because it's almost like where your project is cracking a little bit, but is not quite cracking enough. It's like even like the shell it's half new, half maintained. It's half glass, half concrete. There is really a moment that still needs to be resolved there, and it has a lot of potential. But I think that it still is not like clicking in place a little bit.
Right. I actually I agree with that. And I initially kind of made this kind of bending moment here to kind of draw in like kind of emphasize this and open up this pathway into the courtyards. And yeah, I think I kind of with more ideas kind of building on top of what I already had it, I think I may have kind of lost sight of what I wanted it to be. And it seems kind of more of a secondary entrance now instead of something that I could have capitalized on.
Yeah, it could be fun because this could be like 3 sisters, and that one on the corner like rebels and goes crazy, right? Like,
Yeah.
But you could also like start to think about this view is something like that. What are the planes that face each other? Are the inside faces of these things something different? Is there something different about the treatment where it cracks open? Right, you could take these in a variety of iterations and explore each of those things. So is there something about the faces that face out to the street that they hold one identity, but when you kind of crack them open, then there's this whole other identity to the architecture that's revealed as a result of that?
This is kind of an interesting conversation that's developing, because in the beginning, I know that Nick was exploring the idea of thin slits between the buildings. So that was kind of developed further, and it was 3 different volumes. And as he went along, that language evolved pretty substantially and started making little cues of twisting, like you're noticing on the front facade and thing. And so I guess the question would be is at some point to go back and reevaluate the initial idea and, abandon some and adopt others to, go in that new direction. So I think those are really good points.
Well, and that's one of those things that you'll get more facile at having those lots of ideas and iterating through them quickly and giving yourself that menu of choices,
right,
and then picking one. But I still think it's very impressive that you got to this level of resolution in a half a semester in second year.
Oh yeah.
It's pretty
No, I agree.
nicely done. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we basically have like 1 minute and a half left. But again, I wanted to say that it is a very, very nice project. And, like we, in a way, one thing that you can always test, if you zoom in the first floor plan, one way to test if you are on the right way is, I think when you find like a tough furniture, like for example, if you zoom on what I think is the cafe, the kitchen, probably or maybe the reception. No, sorry, then it must be exactly like that angle.
right.
I think that usually it could be an opportunity or a problem, and it's up to you to make it an opportunity.
Right.
So, anyways,
it's an interesting case study too, and how it appears to be more convincing in plan than it does in the rendering, right, in the elevation. So like the plan could delude you into thinking like, okay, it needs some work, but there's something there. But there's just not the same there's just not the same case made in the rendering, right?
Right. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for presenting. And that was it for our session.
I think I deleted a drawing by accident somehow.
Oh.
I had another circulation diagram. Okay, it doesn't matter.
I think you presented it though.
Yeah,
it was in
in my
the slides.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice
That
work.
was fun. Too fast. Do it again. Encore.
So I think what we can do maybe is just to probably go back to the
the main room, I think.
Yeah, the main room. Yes.
almost, but also like refugee camp like, like ad hoc settlement kind of aesthetic. And I think that has a lot to do with the kind of discreteness of the volumes and the way they're kind of assembled in a sort of ad hoc fashion, and you kind of expose decking and expose studs and stuff. It's like, it doesn't, to be quite honest, I'm not sure how comfortable I would feel going home to this space, right? And I don't know, maybe I want to hear maybe your thoughts about whether or not you were aware of that, creating that aesthetic. And if that's something, if you could do or revise, what would you do differently, perhaps?
Well, yeah, like initially, I mean, it's probably just